This panel is on future-proofing education from crises. And I mentioned at the very start that obviously we had the Ukraine-Russia conflict that is still ongoing, and the refugee crisis that occurred as well. Many of you will also be aware that in Sudan there's also an ongoing refugee crisis, as well as within Afghanistan. And last year, when we had a number of crises going on with the pandemic, we were concerned at QS around crisis blindness, that we can only ever focus on one thing, and often what happens is we think it's resolved and we move on, but it never really does. To take it away, please welcome Rachel Maguer, the Global Director of Communications at INSEAD. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, welcome to the session. Thank you for the introduction. Delighted to moderate this session today with such a diverse panel. I have the pleasure to introduce our panelists who will be invited to say a few words about themselves and their roles before we get into the discussion. So I'll start with Professor Frank Cotonl. You're the Senior Vice Principal and Deputy Vice-Chancellor for the University of Glasgow. Would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, delighted to, Rachel. My role at Glasgow is to lead in the development of the university strategy. I also lead in planning and budgeting for the organisation in academic career development, so the way that we develop our academics, promote them and advance their careers. And also, rather strangely, in digital technologies as well, so I have oversight of that. For anyone who's not familiar with the University of Glasgow, it's one of the UK's ancient universities. We are 572 years old, and we are the fourth oldest university in the UK after Oxford, Cambridge and St Andrews.
Thank you. So I'll now pass over to Kellyanne Watson, who is the Managing Director of the Class Foundation.
Thank you. I just want to take a second to say what an awful photo I chose. Like, I do promise you, once I zoom out, it's actually not a bad photo, okay? My name's Kellyanne Watson. I'm the Managing Director at the Class Foundation. My background is from higher education, but also politics as well. And I've been working in the real estate sector now for about 8 years. I'm extremely passionate about higher education, but also student living in general. And the reason for that is, as the first generation of from my family to go to university, I have not one but 2 learning difficulties, including ADHD and dyslexia, and I come from an extremely low-income background. So I always felt like I, maybe didn't fit in at university or shouldn't have gone to university, but gosh, I proved them wrong. I had an amazing experience, it opened loads of opportunities, and that kind of set me on my path to create education that was accessible for all people and housing that was of quality. And they're just 2 things that I genuinely believe in. And I'm lucky enough to work for an organisation called the Class Foundation that does just that. We started in 2011 to try and tackle the housing crisis in the Netherlands, as it's been mentioned a few times today. And I'll probably give a couple of case studies for the Netherlands as well. But what we realised is it's not just an issue in the Netherlands. This is an issue in every major university city in Europe. And if we do not create better access to housing, then that jeopardises the educational experience. So we kind of do that by running events, research and advising, along with our 107 partners, including Cubo, EAIE, Cushman & Wakefield, CBRE, AXA, just to name a few, and looking at how we could create events and research that really changes the thought leadership in the sector. So that's kind of why I'm here.
Thank you, Kellyanne. Looking forward to the case studies. So now, Professor Emma Stokes, you're the Vice President for Global Engagement at Trinity College Dublin, so you're at home. So.
I am. Thank you. Yes, I'm just up the street from Trinity College Dublin. I hope you get a chance to visit our beautiful campus, which is in the city centre. I'm a physiotherapist. I happen to also have the absolute pleasure of serving as the Vice President for Global Engagement in Trinity, a role that I took up 18 months ago. My background before that was I spent 3.5 years in the Middle East establishing an academic department and a startup program training health professionals in the state of Qatar during a pandemic. So at the same time as being president of World Physiotherapy, which is the global professional organization, and the changes that occurred within the profession in the space of the first, I think, 6 months or 9 months of COVID-19 were probably changes that were so big you could see them from the moon, and were changes that were dramatic in ways that we never imagined. And so from that perspective, bringing a set of experiences that go beyond the university, but very, very grounded within the university. And I'm looking forward to this panel and to hearing some great questions and some discussions from the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our last panelist today, Mary Tufan-Bueno, who is the Executive Director of ECHO, which is a Center for Diversity Policy.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm from the Netherlands. I'm the director of the Center for Diversity Policy, which is a non-profit organization. We were established by the government in 1994 and are a private organization since 2003. Our mission is focusing on diversity, inclusion, and exclusion, not just in higher education, but also outside of higher education. I mean, you recognize this is a mainstream topic for many universities nowadays, but also for many organizations in general, many employers. And I think it's not just an important issue, because providing access, success, and a sense of belonging for all students is something that we all strive for, but it comes with challenges and opportunities. So I'm looking forward to have more conversations about that.
Thank you very much. So today we'll be discussing topics ranging from the impact of worldwide crises, geopolitical tensions, also war, displacement of people, government policies, to student housing, equity, diversity and inclusion, the cost of living, social cohesion and well-being. So quite a wide range of topics. And I invite you to also think about questions that you want to put to the panel. So we would like to have a really dynamic exchange with you as we move through the session. So there's no doubt, and it's already been mentioned, that the biggest crisis that higher education has faced over the past few years has been the COVID pandemic. We all want to put that pandemic behind us, maybe forget about it. But should we be so quick to kind of close that book? I think we did that was a very, very stressful time in higher education. I'm the Global Director of Communications at INSEAD. At the time I was managing recruitment, marketing and recruitment for all of our degree programs, which were all in-person programs, having to change countries every 2 or 3 months. So obviously not very suitable when that crisis hit. So a very stressful moment. I think everybody acted very quickly to try and pivot, give the students that were in our hands the best experience. But a lot of learnings from that period. So we're going to start with Professor Frank Cotonl, who has been closely looking at the challenges that we faced during this time. So what can you share about the learnings at Glasgow from an institutional preparedness perspective from that crisis? What can we take forward in terms of the way we work to be more organizationally resilient in the future?
One of the key lessons that we took away from the pandemic was that what you do before the pandemic actually has a big bearing on your ability to continue to operate through the pandemic. So I'll explain what I mean by that. We had engaged in a range of activities around scenario planning, looking at what a global shock would mean to the university and how we would respond to that global shock. Now, we didn't anticipate the pandemic, just to be clear, but we looked at a range of other possibilities, and actually many of the features of those other types of global shock played out during the pandemic. So that allowed us to understand what levers we could pull, particularly financially, because if you get into a position in a crisis where your financial position erodes very quickly, then your ability to do everything else disappears, or at least is heavily compromised by that. So we'd done a range of scenarios looking at the financial impact on the university and looking at how we would control the finances of the university in these kind of scenarios. And actually, what that led us to do was change the whole financial framework of the university, particularly in terms of the cash that we held, to allow us to use as a buffer during a period of instability. We also had a rotating credit facility as well, and should we have needed that, we could have drawn on that during that period. So it gave us a significant buffer. We also knew what expenditure we could immediately reduce. So in our case, about 50% of our expenditure is on staffing, and there's not a huge amount you can do about that. And actually, during a crisis, what you're really looking to do is protect your people. So actually, we understood where we could make inroads into that and put the university in a secure position. And we were able very early on in the pandemic, as a result of that, to communicate that to all our colleagues in the university and give them reassurance that the floor wasn't going to be taken away from underneath their feet while they were dealing with all these other issues around COVID. The other thing that we'd done a lot of was business continuity planning in different parts of the university to understand what kind of shock might hit, for example, student support, might hit accommodation, etc., etc. And that gave us an understanding of where key decisions should be taken, but also who the key decision makers would be. And there's an important lesson, I think, here about empowerment, because one of the things that you absolutely have to do in a crisis is make sure that decisions can be taken at the right level and taken quickly. If everything has to migrate up to the top of the management chain, then it introduces significant delays in your ability to respond. And the business continuity planning allowed us to understand that and allowed us to be clear on that. The next piece of learning we had was around, as we entered the crisis, the setting of clear priorities. So it's very easy to look in multiple different directions during a pandemic or during a crisis, but being clear about where you're setting your priority helps you to retain focus. And our priority was very clear from the beginning. It was effectively the health, safety, and well-being of our staff and students. And that trumped everything else as far as we were concerned. And most of the management effort during the pandemic period went on that. The other lesson, I think key lesson that we had learned was around technology readiness. So we've talked about pivots to digital and whatever else, but the reality is that to do that, you need to have a technology platform and a technology capability that will allow you to do that effectively. Now, at Glasgow University, going back 10 years, maybe 15 years, we had underinvested in technology, and we were aware of that. It was one of the things that our scenario planning brought to the fore. And when we began to invest quite significantly in this space, where we put our money was in our people. We developed the capability within our people. And the other area that we focused on was the underpinning technology landscape, so the server infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure, etc., that allows you to scale or to pull back as you need to respond to things. And that investment really paid off during the COVID pandemic, because not only did we have the technology platform to support us, we had the people that knew how to use it. And that allowed us, for example, to completely virtualize the student experience within a matter of weeks. Not entirely, because we had some negotiations to do around licenses for software, etc. But in essence, we pretty much moved the whole student landscape into the virtual environment really quickly. And it was that early investment in people around those scenarios that helped us with that. The other thing that is absolutely key, and maybe I should have said this right up front, because in any crisis, this is always key, which is communication. Excuse me. and communication that works two-way. So it's very easy in a crisis situation for a management team to push messages down into the organisation continually. But you have to be hearing things. You have to understand what is happening on the ground, and you have to hear that loud and clear. And you need the same communication channels externally as well with government. So in our case, we deal with two governments. We deal with the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government, and a range of third sector organisations as well. And we made sure at the very beginning that we got that communication flowing in both directions so that we understood the intelligence that was coming out of the external landscape, and we understood the intelligence that was coming from within the organisation. And we were fortunate in that respect, in that Glasgow has a very large medical and life sciences research base. And so we, for example, stood up the largest COVID testing centre in the UK in Glasgow. It started in the university, and we scaled it from there with the help of the UK government, the Scottish government, and the military, actually. And we also host a centre for virus research, which was tracking the evolution of the COVID strains as they were emerging in the UK. So we always got early intelligence on where the pandemic was going, and I'll come back to that, the importance of that later. The other thing that we discovered, and we hadn't really fully appreciated, was that the significance of roles in the organisation changed during a crisis. So roles that on a business as usual level are fairly routine. They do a job, they do the same job day in, day out. In a crisis situation, suddenly they can become the key focus. They can become absolutely pivotal. And understanding how to support those individuals, because they may not be used to that type of focus, understanding how to support them and enable them to do their work is key. And that whole culture of empowerment that I mentioned earlier is absolutely critical in relation to that. The other thing I would say is that in terms of decision making, you need to be agile, but what you cannot do is compromise good governance. Because if you do, what you'll end up doing is making decisions that ultimately you have to unravel after the crisis has happened. So we were very fortunate in that our governing body responded really well in terms of providing much more agile oversight and governance in relation to the decisions that the university executive were taking. And we had a much more dynamic relationship with them, but what we didn't do was try to circumvent governance just to make quick decisions, because that could have led to us making some really bad choices as we went along. So we always kept that oversight. The other key piece of learning for me was, and we saw this really early on, in a big university environment that has so much diversity within it, never assume that one size fits all. And never assume that taking one decision solves the problem for a group of staff, for example, or a group of students. So simple examples like in Glasgow, in the city of Glasgow, we have high levels of deprivation in some parts of the city. And when you pivot to online, then the opportunity that some students have to engage in that is significantly less than other students. And there's a real risk that what you can end up with is a real attainment gap growing as a consequence of that. So one of the early things we did was we looked at how we might fund, for example, even broadband connections for people in their homes, but we also took a lot of university equipment, laptops, etc., and we simply gave it to the students so that they were able to continue their studies, etc., during that time period. Similarly, in terms of staff, you have staff who have a range of protected characteristics, and some of those characteristics actually were more impacted by the COVID pandemic than others. We also had staff who, at various stages in the pandemic, had to be on the campus for a whole range of reasons. They had no choice. And we had other staff who were off campus. So a one-size-fits-all approach in a pandemic scenario doesn't work. Just a couple of final points, if I may. I mentioned about having early insight into the evolution of the pandemic and where that was going, and that, together with the information we were getting from governments, etc., allowed us to think about future scenarios. So even during the crisis, what we didn't do was purely focus on the state we were in. We looked at potential future scenarios, and we began to think about how we might evolve to come out of the stage that we were at. And the intel we were getting from, as I say, from the researchers, but also from governments, third sector organisations, etc., helped us to begin to plan our way out of every stage of that pandemic. So not just being overwhelmed by the situation you are in, but looking at where you might be going is really important in a situation like this. And the final point I would make is that the pandemic took its toll on everyone. And that was both on a personal level, but also the stresses and strains around the work environment and keeping colleagues going, etc., was significant. So, huge piece of learning, although it really shouldn't be a piece of learning, is you need to support each other. You need to be there for each other. You need to watch your colleagues, watch for signs that they may be becoming overwhelmed, and support them. So those would be the key messages from my perspective.
Thank you very much, Frank. This is a really great overview, and I think lots of amazing insights that can also be transferred over to other situations. And I definitely think the scenario planning, very important to kind of think about what could happen and what would we do. And it's something that when we're running, we don't tend to spend so much time doing that. So definitely, yeah, really important points. Thank you. So we've seen a lot of geopolitical tensions also rising over the past couple of years in different regions. Some of them were mentioned in the introduction around the world. On our very own doorstep in Europe, we have the war going on in Ukraine. So Professor Emma Stokes, I will put the question to you. What impact is the war in Ukraine having on higher education mobility? And what have we learned from this crisis so far, which is obviously ongoing?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that fantastic overview, because I think what we learned was, we got to the end of February 2021. I think we all began to sort of slightly take a breath and begin to think that life was going to be coming back to a place of relative normality. And then all of a sudden, the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. And in our university, that was front and center straight away. So we didn't have a moment to take a breath, because on the island of Ireland, we're the only department that has a Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies. So we had 18 students in Russia, and they were there at various different, two different institutions. We had to find out if they were there, what were we doing. So straight away, we were back into scenario planning and thinking about how we were going to get our students home. So very much the lessons that were learned with our students who were on global mobility during COVID was, okay, we know what we did during COVID, and there was that period of time, and again, that idea of working with government to try and work out, do we need them to be coming home? And then all of a sudden, yes, we do need them to be coming home. Now, how do we get them home? And a number of my team are here, and they were absolutely stellar in that. So we immediately, as an institution, initiated a set of activities that were very informed by our lived experience of COVID. To speak to the point around governance and management, we had set up these really, really agile but robust systems within the institution for COVID. So the provost, within about a week or 10 days of announcing, of us all reflecting on this, we went straight into the establishment of the Global Incident Response Unit. And that mimicked very much the structures that we had in place as a consequence of COVID. Lots of people in a room together dealing with the various different issues. From our perspective, we were at that stage dealing with the immediate response. I'd often and I know my colleagues are going to smile at this, and I would often say we're not a development organization, we're a higher education institute, we're a university, because you're managing that immediate response of everyone wanting to do good, and everyone wanting to do good right away in a very fragmented way. So people emailing saying, we want to bring these researchers from Ukraine to Ireland, and we want to do this, and we want to do that, and trying to create a communication around, can we all just take a breath? Because we need to do this in a sustainable and sustaining way that is helpful to the people who were being displaced from Ukraine. So that was one of the pieces where communication was very important, and trying to sort of say to people, we have this, but you're going to have to give us time to set up the structures to do it properly. And I think that was a really good lesson. I think sectorally, it was really helpful that our universities all came together, and the IUA, the Irish Universities Association, brought people into conversations very quickly to try and deal with the sectoral aspects of this. So we knew coming down the track that we had a very significant increase in the numbers of displaced persons in Ireland. It went from roughly about 9,000 to maybe close to 70 or 80,000. And we knew that a proportion of those displaced people were going to be students who were thinking about university. So that has been a huge difference for a country our size, for a sector within our country. That was a big change. And what was done really, really well was the fact that a decision was made to establish a national student and researcher help desk, and that became the single point of decision making, which was really important. The implementation of the Temporary Protection Directive was really great, because that allowed us to then have a framework where people who were displaced from Ukraine and came to Ireland or any other countries within the European Union understood what supports that they were going to have. So we didn't have to deal with all the visa issues, which really made things an awful lot easier. There were some bumps in the road, but that was really helpful. And of course, that was obviously driven by the European Union. I think what COVID also gave us was this culture of forgiveness, that sense of, okay, we're going to try this. Given everything that we know at this moment in time, this is our best decision about what we're going to do. And we might turn around in 2 weeks' time and say it's not the right decision, but for now, it's the best we can do with all the data that we have, and working collaboratively with our colleagues in other universities. I think what was really, really powerful was not just the individual university, but the university system. We also looked to having what was called the single point of contact in each university, and that made things easier, which was for the national framework, there was 1 or 2 people in the institution that were the one voice of contact. I think dealing with the uncertainty about how incoming students were going to be supported within the sector was an enormous challenge for universities and for the sector entirely. So we did all the scenario planning, and we kept thinking, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. If it's this, this is the decision-making algorithm. So we had it all out there, and I think COVID had taught us that cover off all the scenarios, and one of them will hit the target. One of them will hit the mark. And in the end, you know, it was very close to admission time that we knew what the mark was going to be. Was it perfect? By no means. And I think we have to acknowledge that there were things that we could have done better collaboratively and collectively. I think, again, we were connecting in with the wider community, so not just the university sector. So obviously the government departments, the university sector, but also agencies that were supporting housing. So universities became sources of housing. So suddenly we were working with our partners that were looking for emergency accommodation and saying, okay, well, these rooms are available for this period of time. And because of some of the work that I've done in other organizations, working with our teams in Trinity and in other, in other universities as well, just saying, okay, what's going to be in place for someone who comes, on a bus from an airport without any trauma-informed services? And so being able to bring some of the information that we knew from other parts of our lives and our worlds into pushing back to that was really important. And I think what's been really interesting is that we worked very closely with our community of Ukrainian students straight away. So as soon as we knew that this was not going to be over in 24 hours, we contacted our students who were either from Ukraine who had, had come from Ukraine to study in Trinity, or who were Irish Ukrainian. And that really, really helped us. And we still have a very close relationship with so many of those students, because they were able to advise us on things that were important. And then we also had to make sure that we were looking after our community of students from Russia. And that was really important to us as well, that we made sure that the people who were in our community from Russia, whether they were members of the faculty, professional staff, students, that they felt safe and taken care of, notwithstanding all of the decisions that were made institutionally around our relationships with Russian universities. I'm going to stop there now because I could talk about this for hours, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much. Very, very insightful, and I think linking together quite a lot of the points that we did actually benefit from the pandemic. So we'll maybe move over to one of the key issues of that we refer to as the part of the study crisis. So I'll pass over to Kelly Ann. So the GLAS Foundation was founded in response to the student housing crisis. For you, why is it important for the higher education sector to consider where students live when we're discussing the study crisis? What are some of the solutions that you see working in this area?
Thank you. I just kind of wanted to add as well, in terms of what happened in Ukraine and that partnership relationship that happened between third parties, like the housing providers, for example. I actually went over to Austria to look at a project called the Social Hub, and 50% of their students were Ukrainian and had actually left to go and join to fight in the war. So it basically, not only were they trying to support that movement, they were also going through how to get people out of contracts, what they could then use those rooms for in terms of being able to help other kind of societal pressures as well. And what they actually decided to do was work with the Ukrainian government to offer free accommodation for families that were fleeing Ukraine. And that was all housed, and they had to go through a government policy and debate that basically said, because student accommodation predominantly is licensed just for students, so you're not allowed to house non-students in it, basically. So how could they, in crisis, free up and kind of alleviate those kind of policy pressures to be able to help this crisis develop? And it was a really interesting scheme, and it completely created this sense of community and ownership and love and compassion within these buildings with other students from across the rest of Europe as well. I just kind of wanted to give that as an example.
Thank you.
So, back to my question. Sorry. When we're discussing the kind of study crisis or student crisis or housing crisis, whatever you'd like to call it, and kind of some of the solutions there, I think it's really important when we're addressing these types of crises that it's really crucial that at the forefront we're thinking about the housing issues and situations and environments that students are living in. Because without suitable accommodation, students, can have a lot of stress, a lot of issues, both financially and socially, and that could in turn impact their kind of academic success as well. So I think there's an obligation here for universities to take some accountability that if you don't have a housing strategy, or you don't house your own students, that you at least have kind of partnerships with your wider community when dealing with some of these issues. I think it's also really important that when we're talking in terms of crisis that we think about actually what happens in the living environment when a crisis happens. So let's take COVID, for example, here. 98% of your time was spent, on average, in your accommodation while COVID was happening. For most people. So students that couldn't move home, because we've also got to remember, well, I know when I moved out of university, my bedroom was straight gone. My little sister went straight into my room and I was no longer welcome in that room. So, there's lots of people that can't actually even move home, or maybe are estranged from their families. That accommodation becomes 100% of their world. And then not only is that their living experience, it's also their learning experience as well. So accommodation providers had to adapt extremely quickly to not only offer a housing solution, but also a learning solution where students were studying out of their bedrooms. Wi-Fi became we did a survey during COVID. I used to work for an operator, and Wi-Fi was more important than running hot water and heating in their accommodation because of this. So I think it's also important that as we talk about these strategies, that we're fully integrating the housing experience and the learning experience, because they go both hand in hand. Cough at the same time as sneeze, that's also great. So I just kind of wanted to report on something that for me is particularly very, very scary when we're talking about the study crisis, is also that the living crisis and the cost of living crisis is impacting students. So 12% of students reported by NUS in the UK will be homeless at some point in their studies. So I just want to let that sink in for a second. These are young people that come to study with us. 12% of them will, that's hundreds of thousands of students, will experience homelessness. So I think that's really important for us to just kind of start. We have 20 million students in the UK and the EU, but we only have one suitable bed for every 7 students. This means that approximately 11 million students are pushed out into the private rented market. Now, I don't know how many city leaders we have here that look at strategy for cities, but housing pressures across cities are massively increased when we do not create sufficient housing for students. Not only does it kind of push out people that do need that type of housing, so for example, families and young professionals, it also creates a disjoint between the actual type of support that we offer in these accommodations. So we all know that students, definitely during COVID, struggled with their mental health and well-being, just as we all did as well. I was an operator in the UK at the time, managing a building of 500 students, and I also used to run some family accommodation, and this is just from a personal experience. I had my student resident staff that were basic mental health trained and were there to basically put on events and build communities, were walking in on students who had committed suicide. I wasn't even able to get to site at that point because I was working remotely. So the amount of time, effort that we had to put into efficiently and effectively training and making sure that there was programs in place that help support these type of students that are struggling, we could not have done that without building partnerships and relationships and processes with universities. And I think we need to look at that in the long-term trajectory as well. So what I would like to do today is kind of identify 3 solutions that I would love for you to take away to your institutions and think about. The first one is, if you have a recruitment plan, which I'm sure as universities you all have a recruitment plan, does it include a housing strategy? Do you know what the supply and demand imbalancement is? And if you don't, can you work with local government and with the third sector, the private and social housing to create that availability there? Number 2, can you create better partnerships, partnerships that actually have trust in them? Can you create more transparency in terms of your growth expectations, hopes and dreams and wonders for attracting and retaining more student talent? And how can you actually build those relationships and give that really important data, integral data to the university, to the stakeholders that actually need it to be able to implement these strategies that are needed to house students? And finally, what is my final point? That's a good start, isn't it? So, we have strategies. We're going to check my notes. Okay, bear with me, everyone. Okay, so we've got it. There is an issue around planning and policy for the private sector to actually build more of this affordable stock. So what I would like you to do is, with open arms, look at supporting some of these schemes. Not only will this make you way more influential in terms of what type of accommodation would you like to build and students like to be living in, so for example, how far away they are for the accommodation from the actual university campus. Some universities have a 15-minute strategy, for example, for being close to the campus. But also, you can actually quite easily influence the affordability policies that are implemented, the pricing structures, what kind of student wellbeing support is on offer in those buildings, even down to what the design of those buildings are, or the types of students. So do you want to mix international and domestic to build these type of diverse and inclusive communities and cultures that we all want to do within our universities? So this is where I really want to challenge you. So my 3 points are, I would like you to think about your housing strategies when you're recruiting students. I want you to create long-term strategies and partnerships with the right key stakeholders. And I also want you to think about that final point there and how we kind of encompass all that together and create transparency throughout.
Thank you very much, Kellyanne, for all of these insights. I'm sure very important and actually not necessarily thought about as much as they should be by universities. We're all very, very good at thinking of how do we recruit the right students, the talented students to come into our universities, but not necessarily thinking right down to the end of the line of all of these details which really count for students. So moving this over, so obviously these are practical difficulties, but that also can have an impact on health and well-being and social cohesion. Moving over to Mary, as the Executive Director of ECHO, so the Centre for Diversity Policy, you're very focused on this area of social cohesion. So what can you tell us about the constant, you talked with me when we were planning this session about the constant crisis that some students are living through. And how do you think that universities can support these students? What are the issues and how can we support?
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I would like to, I mean, it's great to hear from colleagues about, you know, how institutions and how organizations respond to crises. That in fact has an impact on a global level. But I wanted to take you with me to the crisis that some individuals have based on who they are, you know, how they want to be themselves based on their gender identity, based on being displaced for many reasons, based on, you know, the class or the socioeconomic background that they represent, so affordability. And I think that we always think that higher education is accessible for many students, but and that's how I position this as, you know, the silent crisis or the isolated crisis that some students are also dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And some of that because, you know, where they were born was a context where it is not necessarily the idea that you go into higher education, but, you know, being in school, they get good grades, teachers are stimulating them to encounter and to go to higher education. And so when they enter higher education, the system is not always built for students with a different background. And I think that this is something that you will definitely recognize. And the work that I do is very much focusing on that. And I think COVID set the standard high. I think the different strategies that you were mentioning are in fact the same kind of strategies that I would advise to institutions. You know, be intentional, you be communicative and engage with students even before they enter the institution. You know, also be practical and flexible. And so, you know, those are the kind of things that you would think of. But the numbers are often smaller, although in some institutions, you know, the former minorities or minoritized groups are becoming more and more a majority, especially in certain disciplines. So it is interesting how institutions have been responding, not just to COVID or to many students who came as a refugee from from different parts of the world. And yes, Ukraine is a big part, but you know, before Ukraine, there were so many refugee groups from different parts of the world that probably didn't get the same kind of attention, and who come on an individual basis. And I don't want to position the students that I'm talking about as, you know, needy or not good enough to support themselves. On the contrary, these are students who, against all odds, are doing very well, who are very, you know, persistent, who in their idea of being successful is not just getting their bachelor, but their master's, even pursue a PhD. Although they don't know the rules of how it works within academics, they don't see themselves reflected in staff of universities, and the curriculum is not always a reflection of what they would like to see as well. So, you know, those are the kind of issues. And your question, how do institutions respond on that? I think that that's a question not easy to respond to, because there are so many different practices. And I think it is fair to say that sometimes it is very much linked to the political context and the policy context within a country. And what you see is that even though governments are supportive, sometimes institutions probably don't do well based on even with all the funding, and sometimes governments are not supportive. For instance, for students who, LGBTQIA+ students, although institutions are providing safe spaces for many of these students. And I think and I think the big question is, if you want to be an institution for all students, what is necessary in the how-to part? You know, and there's not, you know, one silver bullet. There are many strategies, but I think the most important part is how can you be much more student-centered? Why don't also communicate with, instead communicate about or over students, so, you know, include them in the conversations. But it's equally important to also have these conversations with staff. And because especially, I think one of the other big developments, especially what I have seen in the Netherlands, were the worldwide social movements. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Asian Lives Matter. Those social movements were having a lot of impact within institutions about the question, you know, what about racism in our backyard? You know, is this something that we have to take into account? And of course it is happening. Sexism is happening. Heterosexism is happening. So classism is happening. But and I think the question is, do institutions have also a responsibility to deal with that too? And I think, you know, that's a political question, and that's not an easy to answer question. But I think what we see is that institutions definitely are also responding to these developments, and are also, you know, responding in a political or policy way. And that's an interesting thing. And I think maybe my last point for now is the student population themselves is changing. I mean, students who are entering your doors now and maybe the coming years are the students who were influenced by COVID, who are much more vocal about who they want to be and where they want to study. And I think that's so, it is not just a point of social justice anymore. It is also, do you want to attract the most, you know, reflective, engaging students who bring more than just, you know, cognitive capital, but also a lot of other capital.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. I want to thank all of our panelists. I think we've heard some really interesting perspectives. Just conscious of time, we have just over 10 minutes left, so I would like to open to questions. If anybody has any questions for a specific panel member, or go ahead. There's a microphone coming your way. Oh, that's a good question.
Hello there. My name's Jo Feely. I'm from Oxford Brookes University, and thank you all very much for your contributions. They've been a really stark reminder of all the challenges we've had to face in recent years. The two crises that we've focused on today have been really fast-moving crises that we've had to respond to very, very quickly and come up with solutions very quickly. Climate change is a much slower-moving crisis, and I think we all realise we're going to have environmental events which are very unpredictable and going to be pretty catastrophic and impact access to education. We're going to see waves of refugees, we're going to see waves of displaced people, this is going to have accommodation impacts, and again, access to education. And many of the models that we're talking about in our own institutions, which bring these 6.5 million international students moving around the world, many of whom fly, most of whom fly more than once a year. You know, so we are contributing to the climate change phenomena. So my question around that context is your thoughts, not for a particular member of the panel, but your thoughts on the role of higher education in preparing for those challenges and in contemplating our models in terms of how we can reduce our own contribution to the inevitability of climate change.
You want to take the question?
I'll take that question because it was certainly something that was occupying my preparation time when I was thinking about this panel. You know, we did have those two immediate crises, and you know, they happened. I mean, they weren't quite overnight, but they weren't far off overnight. And then we have, as you say, these existential crises. And so one of the ones in the country that I know best is, you know, financial modelling and support for institutions, for higher education institutions, and the other one is climate change. And I think what we sometimes miss is that urgency. You know, it's that sense of the lack of the burning platform. You know, we didn't have a lockdown to help us solve climate change. We're working very closely with our newly appointed Vice President for Biodiversity and Climate Action, and I think one of the things that and I'm pointing to my team here because the team whole happen to be here. We bring the world to Trinity and Trinity to the world. So that necessarily, by virtue of the fact that we live on an island, requires that we go off the island, and people come to us, and it's across the sector. But one of the real conversations we're having is about embedding this into becoming that sort of that every small action counts, so that it doesn't have to be so big that we can't do anything about it, but actually that there's a very strategic approach to it, that we have a set of clear priorities as an institution, that we acknowledge that there's a certain amount that we have control over and a certain amount that we don't have control over. So one of the conversations we're having is about the appointment of a sustainable travel officer in our institution. But rather than having that sit just within the VP for Climate Action and Biodiversity, that actually it sits somewhere within us as well in global engagement, because we're the ones that, you know, facilitate students going out into the world, facilitate students coming to us. And it's not all about travel. It's about so many other things. And it's about, I think, thinking about it from a very holistic perspective as institutions, but also creating that next generation of citizens and leaders who are able to hold two conflicting thoughts in their head and still manage to think our way forward. And so it's certainly the approach that we're taking in Trinity is a very holistic approach to this, with clear priorities and tangible outcomes. But it's a challenge, and as I say, it's an even greater challenge when we want to think about moving anywhere off this island, because, you know, we can take a boat. but it doesn't get us very far. It gets us to another island, and then we have to take another boat. So it's certainly on our radar, but thinking about it from a holistic perspective and creating urgencies around some of the things that we really do want to have change about. So I love John Cotter's work around that idea that you have to sometimes create a sense of urgency to get that buy-in, to move people, you know, a step forward beyond the incremental change.
Thank you, thank you. I think we had another question over here.
Thank you. Thank you for this nice conversation and topic, very interesting topic. My name is Marta, coming from University of Rijeka, Croatia. I'm otherwise Vice President or Vice Rector for students, and I have to say we are now facing an unexpected crisis, which is post-pandemic crisis in mental health issues of our students. Also, I have to say that my university, we have 20 years of tradition of establishment of student support center that worked very well. We provide psychological support, we provide career advice, also learning support and so on. And during the crisis, our center performed very well. We had some immediate reactions in better financing and solving those problems. But now we are faced with this post-pandemic explosion of needs for psychological support. And why do I say we were practically unprepared? Because I myself was worried about this growing mental health issues during the pandemic, because we do perform regular institutional service amongst all other also on psychological or mental well-being of our students, and we noticed the growth of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and so on, and we reacted with increased psychological support. And psychologists assured me that young people are quite resilient to such crisis and that they will recover very soon as pandemic is over. But that didn't happen. It happened the other way around. We got the explosion. So for the last year, we are somehow coping with this growing demand. And
Maybe we can, I think,
yes.
We'd be good to hear.
I was just asking for strategic solutions to the problem, and if anybody else is also confronting such problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have just a couple of minutes, so Frank, if you want to take the question.
So I'll be very brief. It's a really difficult problem to solve. I guess the one thing to note is that there's a broader societal problem. You know, certainly in the UK, when you look at the incidence of mental health challenges within the broader population, it's no different from the student population. But what we've found has worked very effectively is interventions before it becomes a crisis situation. So, and actually students themselves collectively can play an important role in that. So a lot of peer support, for example, we have a number of buddying schemes, for example, and peer support schemes. We also have student helplines that are manned by student volunteers, for example. And it's not specialist psychological advice, it's just someone to talk to. And we found that's made a big impact on the volume of people that are seeking that more intensive support further down the line.
Thank you, thank you. So maybe just a few takeaways. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to the audience for the interesting insights that we've had today. So I think maybe just to sum up a little bit the session, I think we've all heard that partnerships are very important. Thinking about governments, policy, third party, this is something we need to think about more and work more collectively. Peer-to-peer support, whether it be staff supporting other staff, but also the students, and how do we bring the right people together and the right types of communication, have those flows happening between all of the different stakeholders. And I think really to think about the responsibility of institutions and governments together. How are we working on things together to move forward? And institutions working with other institutions as well, even more as they do in research. I think on this we're becoming better at it, but there's still a way to go. And thinking also about, very good point that was brought to us about crises that are maybe slower moving, and how should we already be anticipating these. I think this is a great topic also for us to be really thinking about as we move through the sessions over the next couple of days, and it's great food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.